Welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about the enemy class and how we're going to use variables and functions from the character class so the enemy will have some of that same functionality. Let's get started. Now, let's think about some of the things that the enemy class needs to have and what it will share in common with the character class. It's going to need textures for both idle and run animations, so we're going to have a couple of texture 2Ds to store some sprite sheets. It's going to need a position, and that's going to be a vector too. We'll need to think about world position versus screen position, just like we had to do with props. It's going to need a tick function because in the tick function, we're going to be doing something each frame. We'll need to update the animation variables, and we'll need to draw the texture. We'll also need an undo movement function, so we can undo movement in the case where the enemy is bumping up against props and needs to be prevented from moving. And it's also going to need a function to calculate its collision rectangle, so we'll know if it's colliding with props or the character, etc. So there are a lot of things here that the enemy is going to have in common with the character class. So we're going to be copying some of that code over to the enemy. Now, we've seen before that copying code is not very efficient, nor is it very elegant, but it's an excellent way to prototype and to develop ideas and get things working. And then you can make things a bit more efficient and more well-structured later on. So this is the approach that we're going to take. Let's go into VS Code and create our enemy class. So we're here in VS Code. Let's go to File and New File, and we'll save this, and we'll call this enemy.h. We'll also create a new file and save this one as enemy.cpp. So we now have a new header file and a new source file. And in the header file, we're going to define the class enemy. So we'll say class enemy. We'll add a body, and we'll put the semicolon here. And we're going to want a public as well as a private section. So here's our public section, and here's our private section. Now, we know we're going to have some raylib types, so let's include raylib here at the top. So now that we have the enemy class, let's think about the things we'll need to copy from the character class. So let's go over here to character.h and see what functions we'll need. We'll need getWorldPos so we can get the world position of the enemy. We'll also need tick, undo movement, and getCollisionRec. So let's copy these functions, and in enemy.h, we'll paste them here in the public section. Now, WorldPos is underlined with red because this variable doesn't exist in the enemy class yet, but we'll get there. Let's go back to character.h and look at the private section. We have a texture as well as idle and run textures. We have a screen pause, world pause, and world pause last frame. We also have a right-left float. And then we have animation variables, including width, height, and scale. So we'll need all of these things for the enemy class. So let's go ahead and copy all of them. And here in enemy.h in the private section, we'll go ahead and paste these in here. So now the enemy has a whole bunch of variables and 3 functions that need to be defined. Now, another thing the enemy will need is its own constructor. So we're going to go ahead and declare the constructor here before we define all of the functions. So we're going to say enemy, and let's give this constructor some input parameters. We're going to need a position that the enemy should start off at. So let's give it a vector2 called pause. We'll also need idle and run textures since these are what will define what the enemy looks like. So let's add a couple texture 2Ds. The first we'll call idle underscore texture. And the second texture 2D we'll call run texture. So now we have some functions we need to define. Let's start with the constructor. We'll go to enemy.cpp, and first we need to include enemy.h. And now we'll define the enemy constructor. Remember, we need to fully qualify this constructor name with enemy and the scope resolution operator. Now we can use a member initializer list by placing a colon, and then we can initialize some of our variables. We'll use the pause input parameter to initialize world pause. So we'll say world pause, parentheses, pause. Now we're going to initialize the texture variable, and we'll use idle texture. We'll also initialize idle with the same thing, idle texture. And we can initialize run using the run texture input parameter. So now we have our input parameters initialized. Now take a look at character.cpp, and up here in the constructor, we'll see that we've made a couple of calculations. We set our width equal to our texture's width divided by max frames, and we set our height to the texture's height. Now we also set the screen pause, but this is for the character only. The enemy does not need to stay at the middle of the screen. It's going to have its own location. So we don't need that, but we do want to set width and height. So let's copy these lines, and in the enemy constructor, we'll go ahead and paste these in. And now we have our enemy constructor. Let's look at our next function. GetWorldPause is already defined here in the header file. So we can go to our next function, which is tick. Let's copy that, and here in enemy.cpp, we'll paste it and give it a body, and then we'll prefix tick with the class name. So what do we need to do in tick? Well, here in character.cpp, we can take a look at the tick function. Now, we don't need this input stuff, but we are going to set the world pause last frame equal to world pause. So in enemy.cpp, we'll paste that line in. Now in tick for the character, let's scroll down to where we're updating the animation frame as well as drawing the character. This is all stuff that the enemy will need to do. So let's copy this and paste it right here in enemy's tick. Now let's see our next function. It's undo movement. So let's define that. So here in enemy.cpp, we'll paste undo movement and fully qualify the function name with enemy. And for undo movement, we'll see in character, all we do is set world pause equal to world pause last frame. So we'll do that here in the enemy's undo movement. Let's see our next function. Finally, we have get collision rec. So we'll copy this and paste it here in the source file just under undo movement. And of course, we'll fully qualify this function name with enemy. Now let's look at character.cpp, and we'll see that we're returning this rectangle with our screen pause X and Y, as well as our width and height scaled by our scale variable. We're going to copy that, and we'll paste it right here in get collision rec for the enemy. So for your challenge, I want you to create an instance of the enemy class called Goblin. Remember, you're going to need to include the enemy header file in the main source file in order to use the enemy type. We'll need to pass in some input parameters when creating an enemy instance. For the first input parameter, pause, use the vector2 constructor with braced initialization to create a vector2 value of 0, 0. For the idle texture input parameter, call load texture and load in the PNG file from the characters folder called Goblin Idle Sprite Sheet. For the run texture, call load texture and use the Goblin run sprite sheet. Next, call the tick function for this enemy instance in the while loop just after checking for collisions with the props. Pause the video and do this now. All right, so we're going to go into the main source file and scroll all the way up to the top so we can include the enemy header file. So we'll say include enemy.h. Next, we'll scroll down to just under our props array and create an instance of the enemy class. So we're going to say enemy, and we'll call this Goblin. Let's use braced initialization here. Now, for the first input parameter, we need a vector2. So we're going to pass in vector2 with braces. Next, we need a texture for the idle texture. So we're going to call load texture, and we'll load characters / goblin idle sprite sheet .png. And for the next input parameter, we can copy this line and paste it and change the file that we're loading to Goblin Run Sprite Sheet. And then we need our semicolon. And now we have an instance of the enemy class. Now we need to call its tick function. So down here in the while loop, after we check for collisions with the props, let's go ahead and call our Goblin's tick function. So we'll say goblin.tick, and for delta time, we'll pass in get frame time. Let's go ahead and test this out. So we'll go to Run and start debugging. And here's our Goblin up in the top left corner. Great job. So in summary, we created an enemy class, and we copied some variables and functions from the character class, and we're aware that this is not very efficient. So one of the next things is find out a way that we can avoid all of this copy and paste business. We'll do that in the videos to come. I'll see you in the next video.